So, right deck is a thing now, and this is going to revolutionize how we're gonna play Vanguard. So, let's explain and discuss how and why this is going to be the case. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another video, and you can probably expect a lot of overdress related content in the coming days and probably weeks, because whenever we're gonna get more and more information about overdress, there's probably a lot that we can discuss, analyze, and maybe even speculate. And in the coming next days, I'm probably gonna dissect all the big announcements that we got from the previous live streams. And one of those things is the subject of today's video, which is the new mechanic, which is named the right deck. And this is a very interesting mechanic that on the surface looks very simple and has a very direct impact on the game, and you can analyze and expect a certain outcome. But once you start actually delving into the nitty-gritty of what the consequences are, you start to understand that this has way more bigger implications for Vanguard as a whole and how we might approach every little aspect of Vanguard itself. So to understand this video and the discussion that we're going to have in this video, let's first go over fastly what the right deck is and how it actually works. So what this right deck basically is that we set 4 specific cards from our main deck aside at the beginning of the game, and those are going to be a grade 0, a grade 1, a grade 2, and a grade 3. It has to specifically be those grades. Then we put our deck in the normal spot, then we put those 4 cards to the side of it, to the right side, and that is where the right deck is. Now, before we begin the game, just like normal, we put the grade 0 of the right deck onto our starting Vanguard circle, because that's where your starter Vanguard should be before you start the game. And then the rest of the game will proceed as normal, only now, during your right phase, you have one extra choice, because now you can either choose to write a card from your hand normally, or you can opt to discard a card from your hand to select the grade that you need from your right deck to write it onto your Vanguard circle. So this effectively gives us the pure consistency of always being able to write to grade 3 without any repercussion. It basically negates the necessity of having a G assist, because we can always write up. And that is basically how the right deck works and how we can utilize it. Now, the first thing that comes to mind when analyzing this new mechanic is, of course, the upgraded consistency to every single deck. We now know for 100% sure that we will never be grade stuck, at least for the first 3 grades. If they're going to implement grade 4s, yeah, sure, that's a different story. But at least for your main grades, you'll never be stuck anymore. Which is incredibly good, because your main strategy will always be live, and you can always rely on your main resources and your main game plan, which is really good in a generic sense for whatever strategy we might use. But there is a secondary effect to this, which might not be as obvious, and that's the fact that we effectively start with a much bigger opening hand. Because not only do we have the 5 cards in our opening hand, and of course the draw for turn itself, but we also have the cards in the right deck as potential cards in our hand. Because now we can either opt to write a card from our hand, or we can opt to write a card from the right deck itself. This has major implications in your mulligans and potential early game strategies. Because remember back at all the times where you had an amazing opening hand with all the right key pieces for your early game aggression, but you missed your right targets, maybe a grade 3 or maybe that specific grade 2. That is something from the past, because now we never have to worry about being able to write up consistently, and we can use our mulligan and our opening hand to start and search for our key pieces that we need in the early phases of the game, and maybe even late phases if you're more of a grindy out stall deck, which basically allows us to play with pseudo 8 cards in our opening hand, because we have the 5 cards as well as the 3 cards in our right deck, which is an amazing increase in just overall deck performance consistency wise, as we have more cards available to us in the early game as well. This won't be as apparent by just looking at the right deck mechanic itself, but once we start playing with it and we actually see the consequences of this, this is actually a major buff to the pure overall consistency engine of any strategy in any deck out there. But we can go even further than that, because the implementation of this right deck will have major repercussions in the positive side for deck building. And there are two main differences that will occur from this. One of those major changes is the opening of multiple deck slots, which can be utilized for tech choices. Because remember back whenever we build a deck in the last 10 years, usually we have a grade 1 or a grade 2 that we really like to write on our Vanguard circle in the early game. But the issue is that those cards, we want to write them, but we maybe not necessarily want to use them as a rearguard unit. But because we want to write them in the early game, that means we want to draw them as soon as possible so we can write them. So we are up to run 3 to 4 copies to increase the consistency of actually seeing the card. Which means after we've written that one singular copy, all the other copies of that card basically become unnecessary for our main strategy. Now this doesn't have to be always the case, because a lot of cards also have really good rearguard circle skills, but this isn't always the case for every single deck. Because of this right deck mechanic, we no longer are forced to run multiple copies of that particular unit that we want to write on a grade 1 or grade 2, or maybe even as our grade 3 unit, as if we have a strategy that doesn't rely on rewriting every single time, especially with gift markers out of the picture. But with the whole persona write mechanic that will be probably a factor, this could be a different story. But if we just look at grade 1s and grade 2s, this is pretty big, because it allows us to open up those slots, as we now can say, okay, we only run that one copy in our right deck, and the other 3 copies, that can be anything else. So that's at least potential 6 slots, and maybe 9 if we take the grade 3 in consideration as well, that now can be used for anything else. And that means it's a lot of extra tech choice, and a lot of people have been speculating that maybe order cards can come into play here, because now we have much more room in our deck. But I'm a bit hesitant here because we haven't seen any news and information about order cards making a return in the new overdress era. So we have to wait and see if this is a mechanic that will come to this era as well, or it stays with V and Premium. Another big change here for deck building, and this is the second aspect to it, is that deck building itself that we're familiar with might change completely forever. At least for standard. And hear me out on this one, because if you think about building a deck, everyone immediately looks at their grade ratios and looks at like, okay, I need about 12 to 13 grade 1s, about 11 to 12 grade 2s, and maybe around 8, and it can be higher, a bit lower, amount of grade 3s. And the reason why we have this pyramid scheme going on, this pyramid system, is because you want to run as many grade 1s, so you have the higher chance of getting that grade 1 as early as possible, because you need to have a grade 1 on turn 1 to write it. Then for your grade 2s, you need to have a lot of grade 2s, so you can write a grade 2 on your second turn. This is made so the write consistency is an optimal state, so we can write to a grade 3 at a much consistent basis. Now, as you might be aware of, because of the right deck being a thing, this whole aspect of deck building is out of the window. We no longer have to look at these grades and their distribution with the thought of being able to write consistently anymore. So that means the way how we build our decks with the amount of grade 1s and grade 2s and grade 3s can be anything that we want. If our deck doesn't care for boosters, you might as well just not run grade 1s. And seeing as the shield value is going down, as we saw the grade 1 having 5k shield, if grade 2s and grade 1s now are back with the same shield value, then who's to say that we might see decks running like 15 to 20 grade 2s and maybe 8 grade 1s and a couple of grade 3s or something like that. This is now actually a reality if the right deck enables us to do all these crazy kinds of deck buildings. Because we are no longer constrained by the whole system of being able to write consistently up to grade 3. Which also opens up the possibility of higher grade decks with grade 4s, which in the past were seen as inconsistent, might no longer be an issue, because you can run actually multiple grade 4s without any problem, thanks to the implementation of the right deck. So this right deck in itself, on the surface, might look like, oh, we have just the increase of consistency of writing up, but once we look further than that, not only can we see that we actually start with a much bigger hand size, because those right deck cards are pseudo cards that we can access whenever we want in the early game, but on top of that, deck building as a whole will change completely thanks to the addition of this right deck, and enabling us to not focus on the right consistency anymore, as we can just do whatever we want, as we can make these crazy type of builds. But that is just the aspect of the confirmed information what we have here. Now we get into the fun part of this video, and that's the speculation era. And the next 2 pointers that we're going to discuss was brought to my attention thanks to you guys, the viewers, because in the comment section of the last overdress videos, a couple of guys have been experimenting and discussing different aspects of the right deck mechanic, and 2 of those pointers saw very promising in my eyes. And one of those is the side deck in main deck aspect. And what I refer to, or what this person referred to, now that we have a right deck in the game as a core mechanic, now comes the question, are we allowed to switch the cards in our right deck between games? Now, the most important thing here, the answer to this question doesn't matter right now, because Vanguard is a best out of 1 game and format in Top Cut and in tournaments. So no matter what the question is, it doesn't change the outcome. But if the answer is yes, and we're going to go to a best out of 3 format, then this will have major implications for the game. Because what this means is that we can switch our right deck cards mid games, and if we then tag in certain cards in our deck, and with the fact that we can open up our deck space thanks to the right deck, we can put certain key cards or tech choices that can counter specific clans, archetypes, or in this case not clans but nations, that are meta relevant, that allows us to have a bit more counterplay thanks to the aspect of the right deck. Because in game 1, we can just use our main cards that allows us to do our gameplays on the most consistent basis. But once we see that we're up against our bad matchup, but we have a specific grade 1 or grade 2 in the early game that can help us to put 1 foot further than our opponent, then probably the next game we want to switch into that new grade 1 or grade 2 in our right deck to increase that consistency and to change our game plan going further for the next matches. And you might think to yourself, they're not going to allow this because of different sleeves and that kind of stuff, but they can actually say that they can allow this because they haven't stated that you cannot do this. And more importantly, in the past, with the whole original starter thing, that you pick your starter, your grade 0 and your starting Vanguard, you were allowed to change your starter mid best out of 3 matches. So in game 1 you can have 1 starter, but in game 2 you could have a different starter, and this is what I utilize in certain decks that could utilize multiple starters for different matches, and it was a really good way to somewhat do a side deck-ish thing, but with starters you're very limited. Now with this right deck thing, being able to switch out a grade 1, a grade 2 and a grade 3, this is a whole nother story. So if Vanguard goes back to a best out of 3 format and we're allowed to switch our right deck cards mid matches, then this is pretty amazing, because that allows us to do this weird kind of side deck in our main deck, which a lot of people have been asking for a long while, that we want a side deck thing in Vanguard. Now this right deck could be maybe the first step into that direction, but that's one point. Now the second and final point for this video, and this is also once again a big speculation for the future, is potential skill design. They explicitly stated that your right deck cards are cards that are still in your deck, but if they are shuffled back into the deck, they go into your right deck, which means the right deck is seen as a different entity from your main deck, which opens up the possibility of skills that might interact with the right deck. And how this would work and what type of skills they could be are basically infinite, because they could maybe make cards that say they get power or skills depending on how many cards are still in your right deck. The interesting aspect of this is that decks that are built with really good right consistency will basically mean they don't rely on a right deck, and because you don't rely on a right deck, you basically are complemented, or you are rewarded with powerful skills and units. Maybe you have a unit that states get plus 10k power for every card in your right deck, and then less relying on your right deck means your cards or your units are way stronger than they are. Or maybe you have something like a Gastille-ish effect that states for every single right deck card that's still in your right deck, you gain more of the abilities that's printed on the cards. And you can take this in all these kind of directions. Maybe you also have cards that interact with the right deck, that they send themselves back into the right deck, so you can stack your right deck with multiple cards. And then you have a card that states, alright, if you have 10 cards in your right deck, do this. Basically a darker regular soul charge thing, but then for your right deck per se. Like, this is all just random stuff that I'm coming up with in my head, but these are things that they could take a direction for if they want to make an archetype or a mechanic that interacts with the right deck, because they showcase that the right deck is a different zone than your actual deck, and it interacts a bit like your deck, with the fact that if your right deck cards are shuffled into your deck, they go into the right deck themselves, where they came from. So there is an opportunity to do some really interesting shenanigan plays with the existence of the right deck zone on the field. So I am very curious of which direction they're going to take this. And just overall, with what we know, with what the consequences of this right deck are, is pretty damn amazing. The fact that our consistency goes up the roof, the fact that we have so much more plays in the fact with our mulligan. Like, mulligan is going to be really interesting from this point onward for the standard era at least, because they have the right deck system, but that is going to change completely. But what I think is probably the most exciting part about this is deck building. Deck building is basically broken open through its limits. Like, the confines of being able to write consistently is no longer on the deck building itself, and you can basically do whatever you want with your deck. Do you want to make a deck that comprises of only Great Freeze? If you want to be the actual Morikawa, you can do that without being actually punished. And with that, I mean, you still don't have interceptors and shield value and boosters, so you will get punished for it. But there are things like this that you can now think of, and it's actually somewhat playable without the fact that you're not grade stuck on grade 1 or grade 0 every single turn. So yeah, personally, I am very excited about the prospect of the right deck mechanic. And I hope they're going to explain or clarify a couple of things, because one thing they didn't really tell us or show is how do we start the game with the right deck itself. Because in the demonstration, they had the right deck cards already laid out on the field and the deck was already presented. But I'm curious, and this all has to do with the side deck and main deck thing, do we need to present the right deck separately from the main deck, or do we first build a deck, then select 4 cards and set them aside, so we then put them in sleeves and then set them aside, and that's how we start the game? Or do we specifically have to appoint 4 specific cards as our right deck cards and they can never change? That is a question now hopefully they're going to answer, because if we're not constrained by that fact, then that right deck could be incredibly powerful and could change Vanguard in a whole lot of ways. And then I hope to God that once tournaments maybe start this year, hope for that it can happen, that they change the system back to best out of 3, because then I think a lot of players are going to take Vanguard, at least competitively, a lot more seriously, as this opens up so much interesting plays and meta strategies. So yeah, overall, with the right deck, what we've seen so far, I gotta give it to them. I am very excited about this, and it's probably one of the most, or one of the best introductions or changes to the game that I have seen since I played this game, except for G Guardians, of course. That is probably the best change that they ever implemented in the game. So hopefully they're gonna bring that back in standard to some extent, but we have to wait and see how they're gonna do that. But right deck so far, good stuff, Bushi. Good damn stuff. But with that said, I want to know what you guys think of this new mechanic of the right deck. Let me know in the comments down below all your thoughts and opinions about this, because it is a very interesting mechanic and I might still overlook certain things, because the 2 points about the speculation about this with the whole side deck thing and the potential skill implementation was something that I didn't really realize at the time at first sight. So maybe I'm still overlooking certain aspects. So if I overlook something or you just realize something else, let me know in the comment section down below and let everybody knows about this, because this is something that changes Vanguard completely. So that means there are probably still some things that we haven't discovered that might have big implications for how we're going to perceive Vanguard in the future from once Overdress starts. So let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by lovely patrons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I'll see you guys in the next one.